Innocent black lawyer stopped by cop. What happens next is jaw-dropping. The early morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of DeAndre Johnson's penthouse apartment, casting long shadows across his meticulously organized living room. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but DeAndre was already adjusting his silk tie in front of the mirror, a ritual he'd perfected over 15 years of practicing law. His fingers moved with practiced precision, the Windsor knot taking shape beneath his chin as he studied his reflection, a man in his mid-40s, with keen eyes that had seen too much and a face that carried both gravitas and warmth. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help spread amazing stories. Let's continue. The morning routine was more than just preparation. It was his armor. Each element, from the carefully pressed suit to the polished Oxford shoes, represented years of hard work, of proving himself in a system that hadn't always welcomed him. DeAndre paused, running his hand along the smooth surface of his mahogany dresser, touching the framed photo of his parents. His father, a janitor who'd worked 2 jobs to put him through law school, and his mother, a schoolteacher who'd instilled in him an unshakable belief in justice, smiled back at him from behind the glass. The kitchen gleamed as he moved through it, every surface spotless, every item in its designated place. The coffee maker hummed to life at precisely 6:15 a.m., filling the air with the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. DeAndre reached for his favorite mug, a gift from his first successful case, a pro bono defense of an elderly woman facing eviction. The victory had been small in the grand scheme of things, but it had set the tone for his career. Justice wasn't about the size of the case, but about the principles at stake. As he sipped his coffee, DeAndre reviewed the case files spread across his kitchen island. The young man he was defending, Marcus Thompson, was barely 22, accused of stealing from the convenience store where he worked. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but the prosecutor was pushing hard for a conviction. DeAndre had seen this pattern too many times. Young black men presumed guilty, their futures hanging by a thread because the system saw them as statistics rather than human beings. The weight of the case settled on his shoulders differently than others. Perhaps it was because Marcus reminded him of his younger brother, who'd faced similar accusations years ago before DeAndre had the knowledge or means to help him. The memory of his brother's defeated face, as he was led away in handcuffs, still haunted him, fueling his dedication to preventing such injustices from repeating. Outside, the city was coming to life. DeAndre's Tesla hummed quietly as he descended into the underground parking garage, the sound echoing off concrete walls. The car represented more than just luxury. It was a testament to his journey from the cramped apartment above his parents' garage to becoming one of the city's most respected defense attorneys. Yet success hadn't distanced him from his roots. If anything, it had strengthened his connection to the community that raised him. Traffic moved steadily along the boulevard as DeAndre merged into the morning commute. His mind wandered to the upcoming court appearance, mentally rehearsing his arguments. The prosecution's case relied heavily on grainy security footage and the testimony of a manager with a history of racial bias complaints. It wasn't just about proving Marcus's innocence anymore. It was about exposing the subtle prejudices that still poison the justice system. The familiar buildings of downtown slid past his windows, the coffee shop where he'd studied for the bar exam, the courthouse steps where he'd won his first major case, the community center where he still volunteered every other weekend. Each landmark was a chapter in his story, a reminder of the delicate balance between success and service that he'd struggled to maintain. A notification pinged on his phone, a text from Marcus's mother, thanking him again for taking the case. DeAndre felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The trust these families placed in him was both an honor and a burden. They saw him as more than just a lawyer. He was a beacon of hope, proof that the system could work for them if someone was willing to fight hard enough. The morning news played softly in the background, reporting another incident of police misconduct in a neighboring city. DeAndre's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Despite all his achievements, despite the respect he'd earned, he wasn't immune to the reality of being a black man in America. Each traffic stop, each security guard's lingering gaze, each whispered comment in the courthouse corridors reminded him that his success was viewed as an exception, not the rule. The frustration that had been building over the years wasn't the hot, explosive anger of his youth. It had matured into something deeper, a steady, burning determination to change things from within. Every case like Marcus's was an opportunity to chip away at the foundations of systemic injustice, to force the system to confront its own biases. The courthouse loomed ahead, its limestone facade catching the morning light. DeAndre checked his watch, still 45 minutes before the hearing. The familiar route suddenly felt different as he noticed a police cruiser appear in his rearview mirror, its presence an unwelcome shadow. Years of experience had taught him to read these moments, to sense when routine was about to fracture into something else. The cruiser's lights flashed to life, and DeAndre's heart rate quickened, despite his outward calm. Following procedure, he signaled and pulled over smoothly, positioning his Tesla precisely 6 inches from the curb. His movements were deliberate, practiced, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, engine still running, music silenced. Through his side mirror, he watched 2 officers emerge from the cruiser. The younger one moved with hesitant energy, while the older officer carried himself with a kind of confidence that often masked something darker. DeAndre observed their approach through his mirrors, noting details with a precision that had made him a formidable attorney. The younger officer, nameplate reading Officer L. Martinez, couldn't have been more than 25, his uniform still carrying the stiff newness of recent academy graduation. His partner, Officer J. Reynolds, wore his experience like armor, each step heavy with authority and assumption. The morning sun caught the younger officer's badge as he approached the driver's side window, his hand hovering nervously near his belt. DeAndre could read the internal struggle on his face, the conflict between training and instinct, between what he'd been taught to fear and what he was actually seeing. License and registration, please. Lenny's voice carried a slight tremor, betraying his uncertainty. Behind him, Jacob's presence loomed like a storm cloud, his hand resting casually but purposefully on his holstered weapon. DeAndre's legal mind kicked into high gear, analyzing the situation with professional detachment even as his personal experience sent warning signals through his body. "Officer," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I'd first like to know the reason for this stop. I've broken no traffic laws, and my vehicle is in full compliance with all regulations." The question hung in the air for a moment before Jacob stepped forward, shouldering past his younger partner. His face carried the weathered look of someone who'd spent too many years letting power shape his worldview. "This is a high-security area," he stated, the words carrying an undercurrent of challenge. "We've had reports of suspicious vehicles." DeAndre caught Lenny's slight flinch at his partner's tone. The younger officer's discomfort was palpable, his academy training clashing with the reality unfolding before him. The morning traffic continued to flow around them, each passing car carrying witnesses to a scene that was becoming all too familiar in America's landscape. "Officer Reynolds," DeAndre responded, reading the nameplate clearly now, "I'm well aware of this area's security status, as I work in the courthouse just ahead. Again, I'm requesting the specific reason for this stop." His words were measured, each syllable carrying the weight of years spent in courtrooms, defending others against exactly this kind of encounter. Jacob's expression hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, his hand tightening on his belt. The order was unnecessary, a power play meant to establish dominance rather than serve any legitimate law enforcement purpose. Lenny shifted his weight uncomfortably, his eyes darting between his partner and DeAndre. The young officer's internal struggle was visible, the desire to do right warring with the pressure to back his partner, the academy's ideals of protect and serve clashing with the street-level reality of policing's darker side. DeAndre's mind raced through his options, each potential response carrying its own risks and consequences. His phone lay on the passenger seat, its camera already recording, a habit born from years of understanding that truth often needed documentation to be believed. The courthouse was so close he could see the flags fluttering on its roof, the irony of being detained mere yards from where he fought for justice, not lost on him. The morning had transformed from routine to revelation, each second stretching with the tension of unspoken histories and systemic biases. Cars continued to pass, some slowing to observe the scene, their drivers' faces showing varying degrees of concern and curiosity. DeAndre could feel the weight of their gazes, understanding that this moment was larger than just himself. It was a manifestation of the very issues he fought against in court. Time seemed to slow as DeAndre made his decision. With deliberate movements, he reached for his seatbelt release, his other hand remaining visible on the steering wheel. "I'll step out," he announced clearly, "but I want it noted that I'm complying under protest, and without consenting to any searches." The words were spoken with the precision of a legal professional, but they carried undertones of something deeper, the accumulated knowledge of countless similar encounters, both personal and professional. As he moved to open his door, he noticed Lenny's hand drop slightly from his weapon, a small but significant gesture that spoke to the young officer's growing unease with the situation. The morning air felt charged as DeAndre emerged from his vehicle, standing to his full height with the dignified bearing that had become his trademark in courtrooms across the city. His suit, perfectly tailored and professionally neutral, seemed to give Lenny pause, forcing the young officer to confront the disconnect between his training's profile of suspicion and the reality before him. Jacob, however, seemed unmoved by DeAndre's professional appearance. If anything, it appeared to fuel his antagonism, as though the very notion of a black man in an expensive suit and luxury car challenged his worldview. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, though DeAndre's hands had never left sight. The situation balanced on a knife's edge, each moment pregnant with potential for either resolution or escalation. DeAndre could feel the familiar anger rising in his chest, not the hot, immediate kind of his younger years, but something more refined, tempered by experience and channeled through professional discipline. This anger was a tool, one he'd learned to use in service of justice rather than let it use him. Through it all, Lenny's discomfort grew more visible. The young officer's academy training had prepared him for clear-cut situations, obvious crimes, clear dangers, straightforward responses. But this encounter, with its undercurrents of racial bias and abuse of power, fell into the gray areas that no training manual could fully address. His eyes kept darting to DeAndre's face, then to his partner's increasingly aggressive stance, then to the growing number of observers on the sidewalk. Jacob circled DeAndre's Tesla like a predator sizing up its prey, his fingers trailing along the pristine paintwork with deliberate slowness. The morning sun caught the sweat beading on Lenny's forehead as he maintained his position, clearly struggling with the growing tension. DeAndre remained motionless, his measured breathing the only sign of his internal struggle to maintain composure. "Pop the trunk," Jacob demanded, his voice carrying the artificial authority of someone who'd grown too comfortable with power. When DeAndre didn't immediately comply, Jacob's face darkened. "I said, pop the trunk. Or, do you have something to hide?" DeAndre's legal mind cataloged every moment, every word. "Officer Reynolds, you have no probable cause for search. I do not consent to any examination of my vehicle." His voice remained steady, professional, though his pulse quickened as he watched Jacob's hand move to his weapon. The morning traffic had slowed to a crawl now, drivers rubbernecking at the scene unfolding before the courthouse. A few had pulled their phones out, recording devices pointed their way like silent witnesses. Jacob noticed too, his jaw tightening at the audience gathering for his performance. Without warning, Jacob moved to the driver's door of the Tesla, yanking it open with unnecessary force. "If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about," he sneered, beginning to rifle through the vehicle's interior. His movements were aggressive, purposeful, as he pulled apart the meticulously organized contents of DeAndre's car. Lenny's discomfort had evolved into visible distress. His academy training had emphasized proper procedure, probable cause, and constitutional rights. What he was witnessing violated everything he'd been taught about professional police work. His hand trembled slightly as he watched his partner's increasingly aggressive search. DeAndre's heart pounded against his ribs as he watched years of careful professionalism being torn apart by vindictive hands. His case files for Marcus scattered across the seat, client confidentiality violated with each careless movement. The leather briefcase his parents had given him when he passed the bar exam was roughly tossed aside, landing with a thud on the pavement. Then came the moment that made time stand still. Jacob emerged from the car, holding aloft a small plastic bag with theatrical triumph. The morning light caught the crystalline contents, creating a sickening sparkle that made DeAndre's stomach lurch. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the bag hadn't been there moments ago. Well, what do we have here? Jacob's voice dripped with false surprise, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. The bag dangled from his fingers like a poisonous trophy, a planted piece of evidence that threatened to destroy everything DeAndre had built. Lenny's sharp intake of breath was audible in the tense silence. His eyes widened as he recognized what was happening, the reality of police corruption materializing before him in a way no training had prepared him for. His gaze darted between the bag, his partner's smugly triumphant expression, and DeAndre's carefully controlled face. The growing crowd of onlookers murmured, their phones still recording, capturing this moment of injustice in high definition. DeAndre could feel the weight of their attention, the collective intake of breath as they witnessed what appeared to be the fall of a successful black man, exactly the kind of narrative that reinforced the stereotypes he'd spent his career fighting against. But DeAndre's mind was already racing ahead, analyzing angles, considering witnesses, mapping out the legal strategy that would turn this moment of crisis into an opportunity for exposure. His years in the courtroom had taught him to think 3 steps ahead, to see the chess moves hidden within chaos. Officer Reynolds, DeAndre spoke with quiet authority, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing right now. His eyes moved purposefully to the recording devices in the crowd, then to Lenny's increasingly pale face, before settling back on Jacob with unwavering intensity. Jacob's confidence wavered for a split second, a microscopic crack in his armor of authority. He hadn't expected this calm resistance, this strategic thinking in the face of his power play. The bag in his hand suddenly felt heavier, its presence a double-edged sword that could cut both ways. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the moral lines being crossed. Traffic had come to a near standstill, the usual courthouse morning rush transformed into an impromptu audience for this street theater of injustice. The air felt electric with tension, each breath carrying the weight of impending consequence. Lenny had taken a step back, his young face a canvas of conflicting emotions. The academy had taught him about the thin blue line, about loyalty to fellow officers, but it had also emphasized integrity, justice, and the sacred trust between police and community. In this moment, those ideals crashed against each other like waves in a storm. DeAndre remained perfectly still, his posture embodying the dignity that no false evidence could strip away. His mind calculated probabilities, assessed witnesses, considered angles, all while maintaining the exterior calm that had become his professional trademark. The planted evidence was a desperate move, one that revealed more about Jacob's character than it did about DeAndre's. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of confrontation. Among them, DeAndre recognized several faces, courthouse regulars, fellow attorneys, even a judge who had presided over cases he'd argued. Each witness added another layer of protection, another pair of eyes to testify to what was unfolding. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance added urgency to the tableau. Jacob's face showed the first signs of genuine concern as he realized the situation had grown beyond his control. The bag in his hand, meant to be his trump card, now felt like a burning coal he couldn't easily discard. DeAndre reached slowly into his breast pocket, every movement deliberate and announced. Jacob tensed, but the object DeAndre withdrew wasn't a threat. It was a business card, its embossed lettering catching the morning light. "Officer Martinez," he said calmly, addressing Lenny directly, "I'd like you to take a look at this." His voice carried the same measured authority he used in court, the tone that made jurors lean forward in their seats. The card told its own story. DeAndre Johnson, senior partner, Johnson and Associates, Criminal Defense. Below that, an impressive list of credentials and board certifications that spoke of decades dedicated to criminal justice. Lenny's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the card, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. "You might recognize my name," DeAndre continued, his voice carrying just far enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Last month, I successfully argued the Wilson police misconduct case. 3 months before that, I won a landmark civil rights suit against the 12th Precinct." Each word landed with precision, like carefully placed chess pieces. Jacob's face contorted as he realized his tactical error. The bag of planted evidence suddenly felt radioactive in his hands, its presence damning in ways he hadn't anticipated. The crowd had grown larger, their phones still recording, capturing every nuance of this unfolding drama. "Officer Martinez," DeAndre spoke again, his attention focused solely on the younger officer. "I want you to think about why you joined the force. Remember the oath you took, to protect and serve, not to persecute and plan evidence." His words weren't accusatory but encouraging, offering Lenny a bridge back to his ideals. The morning had grown warmer, but Lenny's face had gone pale. His academy training flashed through his mind. The lectures on integrity, the discussions about police ethics, the solemn ceremonies where they'd sworn to uphold justice. Now, standing in the shadow of the courthouse, he faced the moment where theory met reality. DeAndre's phone continued recording in his car, its lens capturing every detail of Jacob's increasingly agitated movements. The senior officer's confidence had cracked, revealing the insecurity beneath his badge of authority. His hand still gripped the planted evidence, but now it seemed to burn him, a physical manifestation of his corrupt choices. "What happens next is crucial, Officer Martinez," DeAndre continued, his voice taking on the gentle but firm tone he used when mentoring young lawyers. "This moment will define not just your career, but your character. The truth has a way of emerging, especially when there are this many witnesses." He gestured subtly to the crowd, where several familiar faces from the legal community had gathered. Lenny's internal struggle played across his features like a documentary of conscience. His eyes darted between his partner, the planted evidence, and the growing number of witnesses. The weight of his badge suddenly felt heavy, its responsibility real in a way that academy training hadn't prepared him for. "The oath you took," DeAndre pressed on, "wasn't to cover up misconduct or support corruption. It was to protect the community, to uphold the law fairly and equally." Each word struck with the precision of a master orator, finding purchase in Lenny's wavering resolve. Jacob's anger boiled over, his face reddening as he stepped forward aggressively. "You don't know anything about what it means to wear this badge," he spat, but his words rang hollow against DeAndre's calm dignity. The planted evidence trembled in his grip, a damning indicator of his growing desperation. The crowd had fallen silent, sensing the pivotal nature of this moment. The morning traffic had slowed to a crawl, drivers watching the scene unfold like a live theater performance about justice and corruption. The courthouse loomed behind them, its stone facade a silent witness to this street-level drama about the very principles it was meant to uphold. DeAndre's next words cut through the tension with surgical precision. "Officer Reynolds, everything from the moment you activated your lights has been recorded. Not just by my device, but by dozens of witnesses." He gestured to his Tesla's integrated cameras, then to the forest of phones held by onlookers. "Every movement, every word, every action, including the planting of evidence, is documented." The impact was immediate. Jacob's face drained of color, his years of unchecked authority crumbling in the face of irrefutable documentation. The bag of planted evidence seemed to weigh heavier in his hand, transforming from a tool of power into evidence of his own corruption. Lenny straightened his posture, something shifting in his expression. The rookie officer's uncertainty crystallized into resolution as he watched his partner's carefully constructed facade crumble. His hand moved to his own body camera, ensuring it was still recording, making his choice clear without words. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting stark shadows that seemed to emphasize the moral lines being drawn. DeAndre stood in this light, his professional demeanor unbowed by the attempted intimidation. His presence commanded attention not through force or authority, but through the quiet dignity of someone who had long fought battles in the name of justice. I've spent my career defending people against exactly this kind of abuse of power, DeAndre continued, his voice carrying to the edges of the growing crowd. I've seen how corruption corrupts not just the individual officer, but the entire system. Officer Martinez, you have a choice to make, right here, right now. Will you be part of the problem? Or part of the solution? The weight of the moment hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Lenny's decision would ripple beyond this morning, beyond this street corner, touching countless future encounters between police and citizens. The young officer stood at a crossroads, his academy ideals colliding with the harsh reality of street-level policing and the thin blue line. The crowd's murmuring grew louder as more spectators gathered around the scene, their phones raised like modern-day torches illuminating truth. Among them, DeAndre recognized several colleagues from the courthouse, legal assistants, clerks, and even a few judges who had stepped out to witness the unfolding drama. The presence of these legal professionals added another layer of gravity to the situation. Lenny's moment of decision arrived with the weight of thunder. "I saw you plant that evidence, Jake," he announced, his voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with each word. "I saw everything." The young officer's hand moved to his body camera again, this time activating its backup recording feature, a detail that didn't escape Jacob's notice. The morning air crackled with tension as Jacob's face transformed, rage and disbelief warring across his features. "You little traitor," he snarled, turning on his partner with the same intimidating presence he'd used countless times before. "You have no idea what you're doing. No idea what it means to be a real cop." But Lenny stood his ground, his spine straightening as years of academy training crystallized into this single moment of moral clarity.
"No, Jake.
I know exactly what I'm doing. This is what being a real cop means: protecting people, not persecuting them. Upholding the law, not breaking it." DeAndre watched the exchange with the calculating eye of a seasoned attorney, noting every detail that could later be relevant in a courtroom. The growing crowd had formed a loose circle around them, their presence both witness and protection against any further escalation. The planted evidence bag still dangled from Jacob's fingers, now trembling slightly with his barely contained fury. The morning sun caught its contents, creating a damning sparkle that seemed to highlight the corruption it represented. "Let me explain something to both of you," DeAndre interjected, his voice carrying the weight of countless courtroom victories. "What's happening here isn't just about this moment. It's about every traffic stop that turned into a nightmare, every planted evidence that ruined an innocent life, every abuse of power that went unchallenged because there weren't enough witnesses or because someone was too afraid to speak up." His words resonated through the crowd, drawing murmurs of agreement and nods of understanding. Several members of the courthouse staff had pulled out their own phones, adding to the wall of documentation surrounding the scene. The morning light seemed to sharpen every detail, as if nature itself wanted to ensure nothing was missed. Jacob's composure continued to crack, his authority eroding with each passing second. "You have no idea what we deal with out here," he spat, but his words lacked their earlier conviction. "You sit in your fancy office, while we're in the streets." "I know exactly what happens in the streets," DeAndre cut him off, his voice steady but intense. "I see it every day in my courtroom. I defend the people whose lives are destroyed by officers who think they're above the law. I watch families torn apart because someone with a badge decided to play judge, jury, and executioner." Lenny moved slightly, positioning himself between his partner and DeAndre. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, a young officer literally standing between the old guard and the future of law enforcement. His hand remained near his body camera, a silent reminder that everything was being recorded. The crowd had grown larger still, and among them, DeAndre noticed several familiar faces from local news outlets. Word had spread quickly through the courthouse grapevine, drawing journalists who recognized the significance of what they were witnessing. "Your badge isn't a shield for corruption, Officer Reynolds," DeAndre continued, his words measured and clear. "It's a symbol of public trust. Every time you abuse that trust, you don't just harm individuals, you damage the entire system of justice." The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, signaling that backup was near. Jacob's eyes darted around, searching for escape routes, allies, anything to help him regain control of the situation. But the wall of witnesses and recording devices had become impenetrable, a digital fortress preserving truth. Lenny's voice cut through the tension again, stronger now. "I joined the force to make a difference," he declared, addressing both his partner and the crowd. "Not to become part of the problem. I won't stand by and watch you plant evidence, Jake. I won't be part of this corruption." The planted evidence bag suddenly slipped from Jacob's fingers, landing on the pavement between them like a physical manifestation of his crumbling authority. The morning breeze scattered a few crystalline particles across the asphalt, each one catching the light like tiny accusations. DeAndre maintained his composed stance, the same posture that had faced down countless opponents in court. "Officer Martinez," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you're demonstrating the true meaning of protect and serve right now. This is what integrity looks like. This is what changes the system." The arriving backup units found a scene far different from what they might have expected. Instead of a routine traffic stop gone wrong, they encountered a moment of reckoning. A young officer choosing truth over loyalty, a corrupt veteran exposed by his own actions, and a respected attorney standing as a bridge between law enforcement and justice. In the immediate aftermath of Jacob's arrest, the courthouse plaza buzzed with activity. Supervising officers arrived, their faces grim as they processed the situation. DeAndre watched as Jacob was led away, handcuffs glinting in the late morning sun, an ironic reversal that carried no satisfaction, only a deep weariness. The planted evidence had been carefully documented and sealed, transformed from a tool of oppression into proof of corruption. The adrenaline that had sustained DeAndre through the confrontation began to ebb, leaving behind a familiar hollow feeling. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered his scattered legal documents from the pavement, each paper a reminder of the clients waiting for him inside the courthouse, clients whose trust in the system was as fragile as the pages he collected. Lenny stood apart from his fellow officers, the invisible barrier of his choice already manifesting in subtle ways. Sideways glances and whispered conversations followed him as he gave his statement to Internal Affairs. His badge, proudly earned just months ago, now felt like a target on his chest. The young officer's face showed the first signs of understanding the true cost of integrity in a system resistant to change. The crowd had begun to disperse, their phones loaded with evidence that would soon spread across social media. But the real viral element wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the deeper story it represented. Each video would spark conversations about power, justice, and the price of standing up against corruption. DeAndre's phone buzzed continuously with messages from colleagues, clients, and media outlets. The news was spreading rapidly through legal circles, and he knew that by day's end, this incident would become another chapter in the ongoing narrative of police reform. But unlike the usual stories of injustice, this one carried a different weight. It showed both the problem and a potential path forward. Inside his Tesla, DeAndre sat motionless, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The leather interior, usually a source of pride, now felt suffocating. Every presumption of success and respectability he'd built over his career had been stripped away in those few minutes, revealing the unchanging reality beneath. His law degree, his expensive suit, his professional achievements, none had protected him from becoming another black man targeted by a corrupt officer. The courthouse security guard who'd greeted him every morning for years now approached with unusual hesitation, as if unsure how to bridge the gap between their routine pleasantries and the scene he'd just witnessed. DeAndre acknowledged him with a nod, but the easy rapport they'd shared felt fractured, another casualty of the morning's events. In the police station, Lenny faced his own crucible. The thin blue line, once a symbol of brotherhood, had transformed into a barrier. Veterans who had mentored him now turned away, their silence more damning than any words. The precinct captain had praised his integrity officially, but the underlying message was clear. Whistleblowers, no matter how justified, faced a lonely path. The internal affairs investigators moved through the station like shadows, their presence creating ripples of unease. Officers who had worked with Jacob for years suddenly remembered incidents they'd overlooked, small abuses of power that seemed more significant in retrospect. The investigation would reveal a pattern of misconduct that had gone unchecked, protected by the very system meant to prevent it. DeAndre's phone rang, Marcus's mother, calling about the hearing he was supposed to attend. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been detained while en route to defend another young black man against systemic injustice. The morning's events had added another layer of urgency to his mission, but they'd also drained him in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The weight of professional consequences settled heavily on all involved. DeAndre knew his practice would be affected. Some clients would see him as a hero, others as a troublemaker. Corporate clients, particularly those with law enforcement connections, might distance themselves. The comfortable routine he'd built over years of careful navigation through the system had been irrevocably disrupted. Lenny's future in law enforcement hung in a precarious balance. His fellow officers maintained a professional courtesy that barely masked their underlying resentment. The young recruit who had stood up for justice found himself isolated in the break room, his lunch hours spent alone with the weight of his choices. Yet in quiet moments, more experienced officers would sometimes catch his eye, offering subtle nods of respect they dared not express openly. The police union representatives moved through the precinct like diplomatic envoys in hostile territory, their presence a reminder of the competing interests at play. They spoke of protocol and procedure, of proper channels and chain of command, their words attempting to reshape the narrative even as video evidence spread across social media platforms. For DeAndre, the victory felt Pyrrhic. Each congratulatory message from colleagues carried an undertone of relief that it hadn't been them in his position. The legal community's support, while genuine, came wrapped in careful qualifications about procedure and appropriate channels for addressing police misconduct. Even those who championed his cause did so from a safe distance, aware of the political implications of appearing too supportive. The day wore on, and the initial adrenaline of confrontation gave way to a deeper, more persistent exhaustion. Both DeAndre and Lenny found themselves grappling with the realization that standing up for what's right didn't end with one dramatic moment. It was a commitment that would require constant renewal, often at great personal cost. Days blended into weeks as the aftermath of the incident unfolded like ripples in a pond. DeAndre found himself spending long hours in his office, the city lights twinkling outside his window as he processed the events that had transformed his professional life. The media coverage had been intense. His face appeared on local news channels, social media platforms, and legal blogs, each outlet spinning its own narrative about the confrontation. The security footage from his Tesla, combined with the multitude of witness recordings, had created an undeniable record of Jacob's misconduct. The evidence was so compelling that the police department had no choice but to act, launching a comprehensive investigation that began to uncover years of similar incidents. Each new revelation added weight to DeAndre's shoulders, even as it validated his stand against corruption. His legal practice experienced a surge of civil rights cases, with people from across the state seeking his representation. Their stories echoed with familiar patterns of abuse and discrimination, each one a reminder of why he'd chosen this path. Yet the increased caseload came with its own burden, the responsibility of carrying so many hopes for justice, so many dreams of accountability. The morning routine he'd once found comforting now carried new significance. Each time he drove to the courthouse, he noticed his hands tightening on the steering wheel as he passed the spot where the confrontation had occurred. The muscle memory of trauma lingered, a physical reminder of how quickly certainty could crumble into chaos. His phone conversations with Lenny became regular occurrences, the young officer seeking guidance as he navigated the complex aftermath of his decision. Their discussions often stretched late into the evening, exploring the delicate balance between duty and ethics, between loyalty to colleagues and commitment to justice. The police department's administration called DeAndre in for a series of meetings, their conference rooms thick with tension as they discussed policy reforms and training initiatives. He sat across from chiefs and commissioners, his presence both a rebuke to their past failures and a bridge to potential change. The conversations were difficult, marked by defensive posturing and reluctant admissions, but gradually, small shifts began to emerge. Lenny's journey proved equally challenging. The young officer found himself reassigned to administrative duties, officially for his protection but effectively a form of subtle punishment. Yet his stance had inspired others. Younger officers began approaching him discreetly, sharing their own stories of witnessed misconduct and moral compromise. A quiet network of reform-minded officers started to form, their conversations happening in hushed tones during shift changes and in encrypted text messages. The courthouse itself seemed different now. DeAndre noticed how other attorneys watched him with a mixture of admiration and unease, their greetings carrying the weight of unspoken questions. Some colleagues drew closer, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and offering support. Others maintained a professional distance, their careers too dependent on police cooperation to risk association with a perceived troublemaker. In his private moments, DeAndre wrestled with doubts and second-guessing. Had he handled the situation correctly? Could he have achieved the same result with less confrontation? The questions circled in his mind during sleepless nights, accompanied by memories of other times he'd faced discrimination, instances where he'd chosen silence over confrontation, pragmatism over principle. The investigation into Jacob's conduct expanded, revealing a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. Each new discovery brought mixed emotions, validation of DeAndre's stand against corruption, but also frustration at how long such abuse had continued unchecked. The system's resistance to change became increasingly apparent, even as public pressure mounted for reform. The process of healing and adjustment took unexpected forms. DeAndre found himself speaking at law schools and police academies, sharing his experience as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. His message evolved beyond the specific incident to address broader issues of systemic racism and institutional accountability. Each presentation forced him to relive the confrontation, but also helped transform raw experience into meaningful lessons. Lenny's presence at these sessions added crucial perspective, his honest account of choosing conscience over loyalty resonating with young cadets. Together, they began building bridges between law enforcement and the communities they served, though each small step forward often felt overshadowed by the magnitude of the challenge ahead. The media attention gradually faded, but the incident's impact continued to ripple through the legal community. Other defense attorneys began more aggressively challenging police testimony, emboldened by DeAndre's example. Body camera footage received greater scrutiny in court, and judges showed increased willingness to question official narratives. Department policies underwent revision, with new emphasis on accountability and transparency. The changes weren't revolutionary. Bureaucracies resist dramatic transformation, but they represented meaningful steps toward reform. Each new policy or training requirement carried the echo of that morning confrontation, a reminder that individual acts of courage could catalyze institutional change. DeAndre's client load shifted as word of his stand against corruption spread. More civil rights cases filled his docket, often referred by other attorneys who recognized his unique credibility in challenging police misconduct. The work was demanding but fulfilling, each small victory adding another brick to the foundation of reform he hoped to build. 1 year after the incident, DeAndre stood before his office window, watching the early morning light paint the city in shades of promise. His reflection in the glass showed a man changed not just by experience, but by purpose. The weathered lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent reviewing case files, of countless hours dedicated to the cause of justice that had become more than just a professional obligation. The morning routine that had once been his armor had evolved into something more meaningful. Each carefully chosen suit, each precise Windsor knot, now represented not just professional success, but a commitment to standing tall in the face of injustice. His Tesla still carried the invisible marks of that fateful morning, but they served as reminders rather than scars. The transformation within the legal community had been subtle but significant. In courtrooms across the city, judges paid closer attention to evidence handling procedures. Defense attorneys spoke with renewed confidence when challenging police testimony. The phrase, like in the Johnson incident, had entered the local legal lexicon, shorthand for moments when standing up against corruption carried both risk and necessity. His law practice had evolved, becoming a beacon for civil rights cases and police accountability matters. The office walls, once adorned with personal achievements, now displayed newspaper clippings and thank you letters from clients whose lives had been touched by his advocacy. Young law students sought internships specifically to learn about ethical advocacy in the face of systemic injustice. The relationship with Lenny had deepened into an unexpected partnership. The young officer's journey from rookie to reformer paralleled DeAndre's own evolution from successful attorney to catalyst for change. Their regular conversations had expanded into formal collaboration, creating bridges between law enforcement and the legal community that had once seemed impossible. Within the police department, Lenny's initial isolation had gradually transformed into quiet influence. His desk, once a symbol of punitive reassignment, became an unofficial gathering point for officers struggling with ethical dilemmas. The younger generation of police officers particularly sought his guidance, drawn to his story of choosing integrity over expedience. The department's culture showed signs of gradual change. Body cameras were no longer seen as threats but as protection for both officers and civilians. Training sessions incorporated real-world examples of ethical decision-making, with the incident serving as a case study in moral courage. Veterans who had initially shunned Lenny began seeking his input on difficult situations, recognizing that times had changed. DeAndre's court appearances now carried additional weight. Judges and prosecutors knew his history, understood that his challenges to police testimony came from first-hand experience with both corruption and integrity. His arguments resonated differently, backed by the moral authority of someone who had faced injustice and chosen to fight it through proper channels. The local media's interest had matured from sensational coverage to thoughtful analysis. Reporters sought DeAndre's perspective on police reform initiatives, civil rights legislation, and community police relations. His comments were measured, focused on systemic solutions rather than individual blame, always emphasizing the possibility of positive change. Community meetings took on new significance, with both DeAndre and Lenny frequently attending as speakers and participants. Their presence together sent a powerful message about the possibility of bridging divides between law enforcement and the communities they served. These gatherings, once marked by tension and mistrust, began showing signs of genuine dialogue and mutual understanding. The most profound changes were often the most personal. DeAndre found himself mentoring young Black law students, sharing not just legal knowledge but strategies for maintaining dignity and purpose in a challenging system. His experience had become a roadmap for others navigating similar waters, proof that standing up for justice was both possible and necessary. Lenny's transformation from uncertain rookie to principled leader continued to inspire others within the force. His promotion to training officer allowed him to directly influence new recruits, embedding ethics and accountability into their foundation as officers. The same courage that had made him speak up against corruption now powered his efforts to prevent it from taking root in the next generation. The courthouse steps where the confrontation had occurred no longer triggered anxiety in DeAndre. Instead, they served as a daily reminder of the power of individual choices to affect systemic change. Each morning, as he climbed those steps, he exchanged nods with officers and colleagues alike, small gestures that carried the weight of shared understanding and mutual respect. The city itself seemed to hold its breath less often when police cars passed through certain neighborhoods. While progress remained slow and imperfect, the incident had cracked open doors that had previously been sealed shut. Conversations about reform moved from angry demands to practical solutions, from wholesale condemnation to targeted improvement. As another day began in the city, DeAndre and Lenny continued their separate but parallel journeys, each man changed by choices made in a moment of crisis. Their stories had become part of the city's fabric, a testament to the possibility of change and the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. The price of their choices remained high, but the value of their impact proved immeasurable, rippling outward to touch countless lives in ways they might never fully know. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, but unlike a year ago, these shadows no longer concealed corruption and abuse. Instead, they marked the path forward, a path that, while challenging, led toward justice, understanding, and the promise of lasting change.
Disclaimer.
This channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.